Over the last week, there's been some pretty big moments in Brexit, from Lectern Gate to the deadline set by Macron and Anterine. So in this video, we're going to run through the drama and answer the question, what's really happening inside Brexit negotiations? Before we get to that though, let me quickly ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We're covering everything Brexit related, from the Supreme Court to negotiations, so if you're into that, then be sure to subscribe. We're also halfway through our series Opinionated, where we discuss a whole range of controversial topics and tell you what our viewers think about them. So check that out if you're interested. On Wednesday, EU leaders gave Johnson an ultimatum for Brexit negotiations, telling him that he had to come up with a new plan for Brexit by the end of September. Otherwise, he'd have to prepare for no deal. This came right on the heels of Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, telling Johnson to stop pretending to negotiate. In fact, to quote Barnier directly, he said, almost 3 years after the UK referendum, I don't think we should be spending time pretending to negotiate. I think we should move forward with determination. With only 38 days left until the current deadline of the 31st of October, it's easy to see why the EU's getting frustrated. Even giving Johnson to the end of the month really doesn't leave a lot of time for the UK and EU to hammer out a fully formed plan, and almost certainly isn't long enough to get a new deal through. To try and pressure Johnson into action and get the ball rolling again, on Wednesday, French President Macron met with Finnish Prime Minister Anterine. Now you know Macron as the hardline French president who wants Brexit done so the EU can focus on other priorities. But at the risk of offending our 909 Finnish subscribers, you might be less familiar with Rene. Rene is the current EU Council President, a position that rotates between member nations every 6 months. Rene has been in the role since the beginning of July, and will be handing over the position to Croatia at the end of the year. Anyway, EU history aside, Macron and Rene met up on Wednesday to further discuss the state of negotiations and the EU's concerns about Brexit. Rene backed up the EU's end of September deadline, saying that if the UK wants to discuss alternatives to the existing Brexit agreement, then these must be presented before the end of the month. Rene went on to say that him and Macron are both concerned about what's happening in Britain right now and the confusion that's going on from there to Europe. If no proposals are forthcoming, I believe quite a few European leaders agree with the position. Then it's over. Now is the time to come up with clear presentations and make them verifiable. Macron and Rene's views don't necessarily reflect the feelings of all EU nations, but it is the job of the EU Council President to coordinate the views of all EU leaders, so Rene will be keenly aware of how the other member states are feeling. So the concern on the EU side is that Johnson is stalling in negotiations. Some think he's doing this in preparation for an election fight in the UK, or as an attempt to blame the EU for issues in the negotiations. Regardless, they're clearly getting pretty sick of it, with EU leaders telling The Independent that they fear that they're being led down the garden path by the UK. So what is it that the EU are asking the UK to do in the next week? What do they expect from the UK in order to keep negotiations on track? Well, they want Johnson to deliver new proposals for Brexit, explaining how he plans to replace the Irish backstop with something he's more happy with. While Johnson was keen to write off the backstop, many in the EU say that his government hasn't been able to come up with an alternative arrangement in order to keep the border open between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Some even claim that UK negotiators have simply returned to Brussels with the original deal, with the Irish backstop merely crossed out. The EU want to hear Johnson's proposals for replacing the backstop, so that they can progress to the next stage of negotiations. They made it clear that they're happy to hear new alternative arrangements, but the UK has, as yet, been unable to provide any alternative plans. Juncker told the EU Parliament on Wednesday that I have no emotional attachment to the backstop, but I stand by the objectives it's designed to achieve. I call on the Prime Minister to come forward with operational proposals in writing for practical steps which would allow us to follow those objectives. So what is the UK doing? Does it have a plan, and will it really be able to meet the 30th of September deadline? Well, the UK has been discussing ideas for months, trying to formulate a way around this problem. UK negotiators and representatives have spent a lot of time meeting with member states and the European Commission, running through a so-called menu of options for how the backstop could be replaced. Their plan was to present a wide array of options to the EU and let the EU select the ones that are workable, then developing full plans from there. This has left some on the UK's side frustrated that they've been attempting to have these conversations, they've been pitching the basis of ideas, and they've not got much from the EU in return. They're now supposedly hoping that with the deadline approaching, talks can start to get more serious, and the EU will seriously engage with their proposals. Now this might sound like both sides are telling completely different stories. The EU often make it sound like the UK hasn't made any proposals, and is just sitting there waiting for someone else to clean up their mess. But on the other hand, the UK government makes it look like they're doing all the work, coming up with all the plans, and the EU's inaction has made negotiations nearly impossible. These stories might sound contradictory, and that's because they are. And that only makes working out what's happening behind closed doors even harder. Now, a certain amount of this is clearly just the standard political theatre that you'd expect around events like this. Both sides will always use the media to tell their stories and exaggerate the truth to bolster their position in negotiations. Both sides make their supporters happy and strengthen their hand by making it look like the other is to blame. So it's only natural to use rhetoric like this in the negotiations. But let's break through the theatre and the rhetoric to work out what's really happening. It's clearly disingenuous when some in the EU act as if the UK hasn't made any suggestions to try and solve the issue of the backstop. Katja Adler, the BBC's Europe editor, made a rather superb analogy, saying it's like a toddler hiding behind their own hands, saying that you can't see them. There have clearly been discussions had on both sides, so it's not exactly fair for the EU to say that the UK hasn't presented any proposals. What the UK has presented is a whole bunch of non-papers, which, to be honest, aren't even close to full policy proposals. Just as a bit of jargon busting, a non-paper is a bit like a green paper. All clear? Everyone knows exactly what I mean now? Okay, I'll explain a little further. When you're in a negotiation and you want to put ideas forward, but you don't want to use them as your official negotiating position, you can publish them as a non-paper. So the UK has been putting forward a bunch of non-papers suggesting different ways that they think the Brexit deadlock could be resolved. The UK isn't entirely innocent though. They've spent a whole lot of time talking about alternative arrangements, but all of the publicly released proposals haven't been feasible and have been rejected for some reason or another. Admittedly, the UK isn't in an easy spot. Negotiations have taken a long time because finding a solution to the backstop issue isn't easy. But if the UK flatly rejects the idea of the backstop, the onus is on them to find an alternative solution, something they've been unable to do thus far. But with so little time left, and so much public animosity between the two sides, is there any chance that the deadlines can be met, and the UK and EU can agree to a deal? Well, that's certainly still the plan. A Downing Street spokesman told reporters in the hours following Johnson's meeting with President Juncker that the Prime Minister updated the other European leaders on the progress of Brexit talks to date and reiterated that when the UK leaves the EU on October 31st, his preference is that we do so with a deal. He spoke about the work that was underway to find an alternative to the backstop that protects the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement, and the integrity of the single market. And honestly, all of this fighting, all of this flexing, isn't proof that a deal is unreachable. It's really common that in the days before a compromise, both sides really stand their ground and try and act tough. And that's not just in politics either, but negotiations more generally. When it's getting close to a deal, both sides really want to show their power and look strong, because doing so allows them to sell a compromise as a win. And deal-making and negotiating is ultimately about reaching an agreement which allows both sides to say they won the battle. By making the UK look unprepared, the EU allows itself to paint them as the victor, the one who is able to pull the UK out of its mess and find a deal. This means that even if the deal reached isn't exactly what the EU wanted, they can still look victorious. While on the UK's side, if they make the EU look intransigent, the sudden compromise looks like a masterclass in negotiation from the UK. So while a deal in the next 38 days doesn't look all that likely, the drama between both sides doesn't mean that a deal is impossible. Over the next week, it'll be interesting to see if the UK manages to make any real progress, and if they can publish any more concrete plans to take things forward. This is normally when I'd say, we will of course keep you updated on how this plays out, so be sure to subscribe to the channel. But the problem is that I'm actually out of the country at the moment, and will be for much of the next 2 weeks. Terrible timing, I know. But I've not really been on holiday since TLDR kicked off, so I thought I needed a moment. That means I won't be able to react to breaking news on the channel, which obviously isn't ideal. The good news is that Team TLDR can't be silenced, and our lead writers, Zach and Ben, will continue to release the Too Long Didn't Read podcast in my absence. So, if you want to continue making sense of Brexit in the coming days, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. It might not be my voice keeping you in the loop, but they write most of the words I say anyway, so it should feel pretty familiar. There's a link to the podcast in the description. That being said, please do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. And if you want more from us, you can search for TLDR News across all social networks. And finally, if you want your name featured at the end of the videos, then be sure to support us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.